And hello once again, this is LC Lupus with the latest video in this Utopian project thing that I'm doing. Because why not? So tired. Anyway, so this, in case you haven't checked out the other ones, you probably should, because this is about a possible utopian plans for what a society could potentially be. Maybe if things weren't so terrible. You never know. So, that is essentially what this is about, and each video goes into some specific area. So, it's recommended that you go through the other ones because, well, they relate to each other and I reference them. So, anyway, this one is the 8th video, and it is about decision-making and democracy. So now we're looking at actually how to literally run this kind of society. How would you actually run it? Now, it's often best to look at why the current system is bad. All right. Let us have a look. Why does the current system not work? Well, firstly, the democratic systems that we currently have in place in many, many countries, it doesn't really work. Democracy is a good thing, but the democracy that we currently have is not actually good democracy. So let's take 3 countries as an example of this. We're going to do the United States, the UK, and South Africa, because I know South Africa best. So what happens is, with governmental systems, is that, because we have these constitutional democracies, so we have party-based systems. So, in South Africa, there is really only 2 parties. There's a duopoly. That's what there is. There's 2 options. There's Republicans and there's Democrats. There are also, other ones, but I think they make up a couple of percentage points of the entire vote. So, none of them are ever going to get elected to anything, at all. They don't even get elected to, I think there's 2 independent senators in the United States, in the Senate, I think. So, people you don't have an option. Are you going to be with the, you want to go with the climate-denying, abortion-banning party, or do you want to go with the party that doesn't do those things, but also is not a good party? Because neither of them are good parties. Someone like Joe Biden is a compromise person. He's not a good president. He wasn't a good choice. He's just a sort of liberal. He's not actually a progressive. He's not going to change things. He's not going to really improve things. The abortion overruling, happened under his watch. And from what I've seen, nothing has happened. And that's because it is not within their interests to do anything about it. It's not actually within their interest to fix things, which we'll talk about more, but let's look at the UK. UK has a similar kind of issue. You have 2 options, really. You have the Labour Party, and you have the Conservative Party. So you either get to be on a more conservative side, or you get to be a conservative side, but one that, believes in gay rights to a degree. Those are the 2 options you have. You have conservatives who are kind of cruel conservatives, and you have conservatives who are less cruel. But really they're kind of both, liberal conservatives. They're not, they're capitalists. Whenever there's attempts to actually, push the Labour Party more left-wing, it gets quashed by the media and by its own party. So you don't really have an option. Your option is the bad ones and the less bad ones. Those are your options. Now South Africa has a similar issue in that, but not entirely, because South Africa obviously underwent apartheid for a very long time. And so the party that came out on top when that ended was the ANC, the African National Congress. They were at first a, protest organization, essentially. They were trying to end apartheid. Now the thing is, ending an unjust system and then governing are 2 different things. Now, the NP, the National Party, just the apartheid government, was a terrible government. It only really a common thing you'll see in South Africa. Now, I'm a white person, so in South Africa, I've grown up around a lot of racists who have told me this thing. Things used to be better. And I'll say, yes, because you're white. Of course they were better for you. it's gonna be better when pretty much, 90% of the government's taxes go towards helping 10% of the population. Of course your life is gonna be better. Like, that's kind of obvious. Like, it's kind of sad that you don't realize that that's, like, what you're saying. You don't realize that you're saying something very silly. And just extremely ignorant. Because of course it was better for you. Duh. Anyway, apartheid ends, the ANC comes to power. Now, they were a liberation movement, not necessarily suited towards governance. And of course, something that didn't really help matters was that South Africa had something called the Bantu Education Act. And what happened there was that black people in South Africa during apartheid were intentionally less educated. The government gave them a weaker education on purpose, because when people are very educated and knowledgeable, they're able to fight against you much more effectively. If you kind of essentially keep the population stupid, they're much easier to control. So, you get all these people who now know that there's injustice, they fight against it, and they win, which is good. Apartheid is ended. But now, those same people who were fighting are now the ones who are expected to run the country. And that doesn't necessarily work. Now, in South Africa, the ANC has won every single election cycle since 1994. In 2004, they even got a supermajority. They got 69% of the vote. So they could enact laws. Like, they had complete control, essentially. Now, their power has diminished. I think they've just dipped below 50% of the vote. But nobody else can match them. The DA, which is the next biggest party, usually gets about somewhere between like 15 and 20% of the vote. And then the EFF gets somewhere around, that's the Economic Freedom Fighters, they get somewhere in the realm of 10%. And then the rest of the people are all the small parties. You get all sorts of small parties, you'll get like, of course, there's probably a weed party, there's a Christian party, there's other random parties. And none of them will ever gain power. It's really just the ANC. Now, the ANC hasn't exactly run the country very well. South Africa, right now, faces a heavy electricity crisis and a heavy corruption crisis. Not just to mention various service delivery issues, the things that are not as important, but are important for people's daily lives. Things like the fact that there's potholes absolutely everywhere. Which is not the main issue. The main issue really is the other things like just incompetent leadership, heavy corruption and nepotism and these kind of things. These are big problems. Major, major problems. And the fact that our leaders have committed crimes, that is not a good thing, obviously. However, the DA is not a replacement solution. They're not racist. Well, they kind of are, but they, for instance, were the party that when the pandemic happened, they did the same kind of talking points as the American Republican Party. So they're not really an option. And then you get the EFF. Now, the EFF are quite left-wing, but they're also very sort of nationalist. And people like me don't exactly feel welcome in that party, because while I might be extremely left-wing, the EFF has famously been kind of anti-white. Which now obviously you can understand why that would be, but as a white person, I would not feel comfortable supporting them in that sense, because they are vehemently anti-white with quite a lot of controversies over years of stoking actual violence. So that's not great. So South Africa doesn't really have any options. There's the ANC who will always win, and then the other two aren't really good options either. The ones are conservatives, and the other ones don't want to work with white people at all. So you see, you get these two issues. Now, we're not going to reconcile that. That's just not going to work. So that's great. Yet we still act as if this democratic system we have works. Because these systems are not built on who is actually best to rule. They are built on loyalty. Loyalty is one of the absolute worst things that you can have towards a political party or your employer. Don't have loyalty towards your employer. Your employer is not your friend. They're there to take your money. They're there to exploit your labor. They're not your friend. Anyway, the same is true of political parties. In America, you get this expression, blue no matter who. which is an expression saying it doesn't matter who the Democratic nominee is, you have to vote for him because he's better than the Republican. And now I would broadly agree, but that's a low bar. So, for instance, Joe Biden effectively ran on the idea of he is not Trump. Now, being better than Trump is a very, very low bar to cross, like most people do. But he represents the status quo, things not changing too much, so people like him. Well, centrists like him. And that's the thing. It's about maintaining the status quo, when that shouldn't be the case. The status quo can be maintained if the status quo is good. If the status quo is not good, then it should not be maintained. When people are going bankrupt because of a flu, or because they had an accident and they had to go to a doctor, if they're going bankrupt and losing their house because of cancer treatments, that is a failed society. Your society has failed. And that is the case here as well. So, I would say things should be a bit different. First off, political parties should be completely obliterated because political parties lead to this idea of loyalty. You can't have loyalty to something that is not a political party, if it doesn't happen again. Now also, of course, very stringent term limits. Very stringent. Okay? Very heavy term limits. Okay? Like a single time being like a leader. Because here's the thing. I teach history. It's one of my subjects that I teach. And one of the things you'll find in American history especially, which I've taught American history quite a bit, is that you'll constantly see when someone comes to power, a president comes to power, their first term, they don't really do much. Their second term, they do something. They actually do something more. There is a reason for that. It's because you want to get re-elected, so you make sure to be as centrist as possible and not really do any progress for the your first term, and say that for your second term because you can't be re-elected after that. That's terrible. It means that you are not actually doing anything. And you'll also see this. People, like politicians, only start doing things when it's getting close to an election cycle. They'll be like, oh, we're actually going to do things now because it will make us get votes, basically. That is a failure of democracy. That should not exist. I just heard outside that my fence is popping. Seems to have stopped. I live in the middle of nowhere, so we have an electric fence. Anyway, if the alarm goes off, I'm going to have to leave. Let's just continue as if that won't happen. So, the problem is that we have a system that doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work because the system is based on trying to win votes. And trying to win votes is not what democracy should be. Democracy should be everybody votes for a thing, and then the thing happens. Not everybody votes for a person who claims they will do things. So rather, major decisions should be essentially decided by democracy. Now, the problem is, major democracy is a bit difficult, because it's difficult to mobilize an entire population for an election every single time you have to make a decision. That's why we have political leaders. So, simple. Instead, we have more of a sortition kind of an orientation. People are chosen by lottery to be politicians. Okay? Those people will then act democratically within the Congress. Those people cannot be re-elected. Now, some of those, I would say, should be able to be essentially elected into a higher office. However, that higher office is the highest you can go. And that higher office is essentially like a council. There should be no single leader. There should not be a president. That is not something that should be done. There should be essentially a council at the top of the top people who make the final decisions based on what the people want. And obviously, if there's any kind of outcry about something, then there should be larger votes growing in the actual general public. But now the general public doesn't necessarily need to make decisions about international affairs or how the major systems are going to work. However, within your community, so your communal sense or whatever, there should most definitely 100% be robust democratic decision making. your little society there should be making decisions that affect that society, and it should include everybody who wants to participate. If you go to, like, say, the town hall, you get a vote. If you don't go, then your vote doesn't count, obviously. And I would say also, because we would have the internet, you could also apply online, but that would be, applying online. There have been issues with that in the past, so it's often better to do it more so in person. But of course, in a system like this, where, remember, work isn't something you're forced to do all the time, you'll be able to actually take part in your community. Now, one of the reasons that it's such a problem in, say, America, is because America is a terrible country, and America has not made it a public holiday for voting day. So which means poor people are just less likely to vote. It's just one of the ways in which you can suppress votes, so that, yes, of course, no, we don't, we're not racists. Black people can vote. Of course they can. But we're not going to make it a public holiday. And most black people have to work. And if you're going to say to your boss, listen, I want to take the day off because I want to go vote, most of your bosses will say, no, that's not a valid reason to take a day off. That is nonsense. But that is the reality of the situation. Because bosses are bad people. That should be something that happens. They should be allowed to vote. Everyone should be allowed to vote. And in the current system, it does not work. So there should be a sortition where people are randomly, basically by lottery, allocated into, say, the Congress, where decisions are made. And they can't get repeated term limits, which means the reason that this is a good, much better system than the current one is because, do you know who most politicians are? Most politicians are rich people. They're already rich. You don't really get many politicians who were like a carpenter, a politician who was a janitor, because they don't have the education to know how to actually get into this. So they just don't get into it. But in this system, this more utopian system, they would be able to, because it would not be something that is held from you on purpose. So that is a much better system, in my opinion, than that. Now, also, I kind of like the idea of a cloistered style. Now, I learned about this when I had to learn a whole bunch of stuff for my dissertation about Japan. Japan had this system called a cloistered emperor. Basically, what happened was, you were an emperor, but eventually you kind of got tired of doing all the pageantry and stuff, so you decided to leave and basically become a monk. So you're no longer the emperor. However, you are still essentially in control, but your kid is now the one who's technically in control, but all the real decisions go through you. So you get to basically be on holiday while also making all the decisions. Now, in a sense, I like this idea. The idea that there's no single leader. However, people who have been at the top of government, who've had their time in government, who've had their time in like the highest council. So you can't get re-elected to the lower level, but you can get elected up into the higher level. And if you do get there, you still only have one term limit, but the people who are there can become advisors later on. Essentially a cloistered style, in a sense. The idea that they don't have real political power, but they can be help to the younger generation. Obviously, they don't actually have the political power, but they can be there to be advisors. It's good to have the older people as advisors because they have gone through things. So, of course, there's constant democratic elections going on all over the place, like democratic decision making, and this it is everywhere. It's not just in like your community, but it's also in your workplace. Because here's the thing: you get an idea called a cooperative, and a cooperative, when done right, is the idea that we should not be using the autocratic system of ownership that we currently have in business. Now, let me explain this a little bit for people who don't know about co-ops. We tend to believe in sort of more westernized countries that, democracy is good. Look at all those other backward countries with their dictators. Yet, we seem to have no problem with having a dictator in a business. Because the owner of a business, so a big business, has the sole power to do all sorts of things, hiring, firing, controlling what you do. Why are we, and also this is often hereditary dictatorships. Gigantic corporations are often passed on to the kids. Which means it's a hereditary dictatorship. It's a monarchy. Why should you have that supreme power? Answer, you shouldn't. Instead, decisions at a business should be decided democratically. Now, obviously, in this system, there wouldn't actually be businesses, because that implies profit-making. However, if everybody could come together and decide the best possible ways to do things, the best possible way to allocate work, etc., then you have a more democratic system of work. And that is much, much, much better than the current autocratic system. Because autocracy is not a good thing. It's, famously, dictatorships are, what's that word? Bad. Dictatorships are bad. Just for the some conservatives in the back, dictatorships are bad. Anyway, so now that system I spoke about, the sortition thing, is more so on a larger regional and international level, right? So you get communal level, but now this society shouldn't have any countries, because countries breeds animosity. So instead, it's all an international system with small communities, but then there would be sort of, say, a larger, say, Southern Africa, Western Africa, Eastern Africa, sort of larger governments that supervise what's happening there and deal with any issues, and then they report to the international system, right? And the international system is the one that then determines anything major. So say, for instance, when a pandemic happens, it should not be on a communal basis. It should be on an international basis. Sometimes things should not be communal. Sometimes they should be international. And sometimes things should not be international, and they should be communal. So that is how it should be. So there's more sort of a centralized leadership with no single leader, because single leaders are bad. That leads to autocracy and dictatorships and what have you. That should not exist. No political parties. Anything large scale must be decided much more on this kind of democratic system using sortitioned leaders. And that's how I would say that our governmental system should be laid out. And also our businesses, just decision-making in general should be up to the people, not some random rich person who was able to afford a political campaign. Like, I couldn't become a politician. That's ridiculous. I don't have money to waste on maybe getting elected. If you can get elected, sure, you can make money, but that's not the way it is. So a lot of people who are much more left-wing kind of don't have the money, because being right-wing, a lot of people are born right-wing because they're born rich. So you're like, oh no, we're fiscally conservative, Those people who are fiscally conservative are the so-called liberals, who control the supposedly more left-wing parties. They're still rich people. They're still trading on the stock market, even though they shouldn't, even though it's basically insider trading. All of these kind of things still exist, and they're bad things. They shouldn't exist. So, we should end them. Quite simple. The current system doesn't work. Dictatorship doesn't work. Instead, we should have a much more communal, proper democracy system, because the current system is not real democracy. It's a laughable facsimile of democracy. It's pretending to be democracy. It's not really democracy. So, yeah, that will be the end of this one. This one got a bit dark there at the end, I suppose, but oh well. So, I've been LC Lupus. You can find me on the social medias at LC_Lupus. If you want to do that for some reason, you can look at pictures of dogs and nature on my Instagram and hear me ranting about nonsense, and sometimes not nonsense, on Twitter. Anyway, other than that, you can check out The Cyborg Wilderness, which is a book I wrote, and it's sort of a piece of eco-fiction about a post-apocalyptic world in which the sole survivor of this war that led to the apocalypse, who is a cyborg, she is searching for some kind of hope within this world, and it's written in a intentionally stunted style, and maybe people like it. Give it a look. Other than that, I think I forgot to do this in the last video because I do forget this. Do the usual YouTube stuff. Please, if you can, the like, the comment, the subscribe, the sharing, the telling people how much you absolutely love this whole series thing. I think that's going to be it then. That's it. I hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and ta-ta.